No one tells you that sometimes the most dangerous place is home. I walked out of the house where my blood once hit the kitchen floor, clutching my trembling 6-year-old daughter. I wasn't running from a stranger, I was running from my own parents. And in that moment, I knew some escapes don't just save your life, they save what's left of your soul. Before I share with you how my parents heartlessly kicked me out of the house along with my little 6-year-old daughter, let me know where you're watching this video from. And if you've ever had to start over from nothing, with nothing but your determination and faith in yourself, leave a comment and hit subscribe so I know you're not alone. Now, let's continue with the story. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32, and 6 months ago I had a house, a husband, and the kind of curated life people envy in passing 4 bedrooms. Wraparound porch, matching dinnerware, all of it a glossy magazine spread I used to call normal. Tyler and I were a dual-income couple in a quiet suburb of Rochester, New York, raising our 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, in a well-manicured dream that hid its fractures behind white shutters and real estate value. I was a marketing coordinator, pulling in a modest but steady salary of $65,000 a year, while Tyler floated comfortably on a 6-figure income from his finance job. Our life was ordered, predictable, well-branded, until it wasn't. The first fracture came one Tuesday evening as casually as a forgotten umbrella. A dinner meeting I had scheduled was canceled last minute, so I came home early expecting nothing more than leftovers and a glass of wine. What I found instead, what I stumbled upon in our shared bedroom, was Tyler, and a woman named Brooke who had been introduced to me at a holiday party as just someone from his office. I'd shaken her hand, smiled politely. Later that night, I watched her reach for the sheets I had laundered that morning. Tyler didn't even flinch. He looked annoyed, like I'd interrupted a meeting. "You weren't supposed to be home until 8. He said, his voice flat, as though the betrayal wasn't just expected, it was inconvenient for me to witness it. The unraveling happened quickly after that. Lawyers, mediators, paperwork that blurred into spreadsheets of who owned what. Tyler, with his connections and his smile that had always been more charming than honest, weaponized his income and his attorney to ensure I walked away with the scraps. No house, no cushion. A co-parenting schedule with all the flexibility of a prison sentence and child support payments that arrived only when he wasn't vacationing in Aspen or photographing artisanal sushi with his new girlfriend, Yes Brooke. With the financial rug pulled out from under me and no consistent child support, my savings drained faster than I could replenish them. Rent in Rochester was suddenly astronomical when I wasn't splitting it. I sold my car for an older model. I canceled subscriptions, thrifted Sophie's clothes, and made $2 stretch where 5 used to feel normal. Every choice felt like a negotiation between survival and pride. 3 months into the freefall with no affordable options left, I called my parents. Barbara and Glenn Carter still lived in the same house. I grew up in a 3-bedroom ranch in a quiet working-class neighborhood just outside the city. It wasn't glamorous, but it was familiar. When I told my mother we needed a place to stay, her answer was immediate and practiced: family takes care of family. But beneath her voice, I heard something else, an old familiar disappointment. That judgmental sigh she used to give when I brought home a C in calculus or skipped Sunday service. They had been married for nearly 40 years, my parents. Old school values tighter than a fist around a glass of bourbon. Divorce to them was failure, and failure for a woman especially was a sign of poor character. They never liked Tyler, but they also never forgave me for choosing him. Still, they welcomed us in. My childhood bedroom had been cleaned, repainted in soft green tones. Sophie's tiny desk was set up in the corner with a box of markers and a stack of coloring books. I exhaled, thinking maybe, just maybe, this would be the space we needed to rebuild. It took exactly 10 days for that illusion to break. It began with the smallest things. My mother's remarks about today's women giving up on marriages too easily, her persistent suggestions that I should apply for entry-level receptionist jobs, despite my degree and years of experience. My father's pointed silence whenever I brought up Tyler or Sophie's new school. The message was always the same, dressed in different clothes. You failed. You're disrupting our peace. You should be grateful. But gratitude turned toxic when it became currency. When every box of cereal I bought was scrutinized. When my father sighed over his paper at breakfast as if my presence added weight to his back. When Sophie stopped speaking loudly in the house, her words turning to whispers, her footsteps softer than they should have been for a child. It wasn't just the tension, it was the redefinition of who I was. In that house, I was no longer Emily the professional, the mother the fighter who had clawed her way out of legal limbo. I was a dependent again, a child in grown-up clothes. And worse, I could see Sophie shrinking with me, learning that being small and quiet was the way to keep the peace. Still, I told myself it was temporary. I had a promising job lead with a company called North Star Health Strategies, a position that could bring in enough to get us back on our feet. I made plans. I searched apartments. I kept Sophie hopeful with whispered bedtime promises, ones I sometimes barely believed myself. But then came the birthday. Sophie turned 6 and I'd saved for weeks to throw her a small party, balloons, simple snacks, a homemade cake, a few classmates. My mother decided it wasn't enough. She hijacked the planning, invited relatives we hadn't seen in years, ordered a cake that cost more than I spent on groceries for the month, and bought gifts that made mine look like stocking stuffers. She told me within Sophie's earshot, "This is what a proper birthday looks like. If you hadn't thrown your marriage away, maybe you could have done it yourself." That night, after I put Sophie to bed, I heard them in the kitchen. "She's getting comfortable," my mother said, her voice sharp and brittle. "She has no reason to leave. She's not trying hard enough," my father agreed. "Free childcare, free rent. It's too easy for her to take advantage." Their words weren't just cruel, they were wrong. I was working every day to claw us out of this. I was trying desperately to do it without collapsing. And then came the morning it all broke. A spilled glass of orange juice. A stain on an antique lace tablecloth. My mother's voice rising like a siren, her hands trembling with rage. My father entering, taking one look at the scene, and siding with her as he always had. The words, the accusations, the threats to throw us out. And then the slap. Sudden, shocking, powerful enough to knock me sideways into the kitchen counter. My head hit the edge, and I crumpled. Sophie screamed. Blood streamed down my temple. In that instant, I stopped being someone's daughter. I became a mother with one job: to get my child out of danger. And I did. We packed 2 suitcases. I held Sophie's hand and walked us out that door. And we didn't look back. There's a strange silence that follows violence, a hollow ringing that burrows into your bones and stays there long after the shouting stops, long after the blood dries, long after your body steadies, but your soul does not. That's what I heard as I buckled Sophie into her booster seat, the wind catching strands of her hay. That first night, I barely slept. Sophie curled against me on the narrow cushions, my arm around her, my head throbbing from the stitches, the shame, the shock. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's hand, the look in his eyes, the slow unfolding of my mother's silence. The next morning, reality arrived like an unwelcome visitor. We had no home, no furniture, no real money to speak of until my first paycheck came through, and even that wouldn't be for several weeks. Jessica's boyfriend suggested helping me gather our remaining things from my parents' house. "They won't try anything with me there," he said, and I clung to that small promise of safety. Barbara answered the door when we returned, her face unreadable when she saw the bruising around my eye, the swelling where the stitches pulled at my skin. "Richard isn't home," she said as if it mattered. "We're just here to collect our things," I said, my voice flat, my eyes not meeting hers. She said nothing more, just stepped aside and watched as we filled the car with our clothes, Sophie's school supplies, and the stuffed animals she hadn't wanted to leave behind. I moved quickly, methodically, as if touching anything longer than necessary would poison me. I didn't ask questions, I didn't make speeches, I just gathered the pieces of a life we no longer lived. Before we left, I turned to face my mother one last time. "I don't expect an apology," I said, "but I want you to know that Sophie and I will be okay, and we will not be coming back." She tilted her chin, her voice clipped. "You always were dramatic, Emily. Let us know when you're ready to behave like an adult again." I left without another word. Jessica's space became tight quickly. She was generous always, but her apartment wasn't meant for 2 extra bodies, especially not a 6-year-old who had started waking in the night, trembling from dreams she couldn't name. Michael slept on the floor while Sophie and I shared the couch. Even then, guilt pressed against me like another body in the room. "We need more room," I said after a few days, "and I can't keep imposing on you like this." Jessica nodded, understanding without judgment. There's a women's shelter nearby, transitional housing. It's not what you think. It's clean, safe, structured, just until your job starts. I resisted the idea. Pride. Maybe fear. Definitely. But one look at Sophie, exhausted and fragile, made the choice for me. The pamphlet from the clinic was still in my bag, crumpled but legible. I called, gave our names, and within 24 hours, we were placed in a small private room at New Horizons, a transitional shelter for women and children. It wasn't luxurious. The beds were twin-sized and creaked when we moved. The bathrooms were shared. Meals were on a schedule. But it was clean, it was warm, it was safe. The staff were kind, especially Miss Tabitha, who ran the children's program. "You're going to meet some new friends," she told Sophie on our first morning, "and make some beautiful art." Sophie looked up at me uncertain, but I smiled. "It's okay, baby. I'll be right next door." That night after Sophie fell asleep, I stared at the ceiling, wondering how my life had ended up here. Not 6 months ago, I'd been eating crab cakes on a beach in Cabo. Now I was sharing a bunk bed with my daughter in a shelter, waiting for a job that might be our only chance at freedom. And yet there was something else. Something beneath the shame and fatigue. A seed of clarity, small but unmistakable. We were out, away from the manipulation, the judgment, the control. The silence that followed violence was still in my bones. Yes, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for the next blow. We were finally free to begin again, even if we were starting from the floor. Freedom, I learned, doesn't arrive in a single cinematic moment. It doesn't crash through the door and sweep you into the light. It comes in pieces, in measured breaths, in safe sleeps, in the way Sophie finally laughed again 3 days into our stay at New Horizons. Her laughter wasn't loud, not yet, but it was real, soft, and bird-like. Something that fluttered inside me and reminded me that hope wasn't dead, just bruised. We were given a room with chipped paint and donated linens, and somehow it felt like a palace. Because no one yelled, no one shamed, no one told me I was less than what I knew myself to be. I woke every morning at 5:30, before the lights flickered on, before the hallways filled with footsteps and murmured prayers. I'd wash my face in cool water, sip instant coffee from a paper cup, and review job offers like they were lifelines, because they were. North Star Health Strategies called on a Monday. Their recruiter, a calm-voiced woman named Tanya, offered a final interview via Zoom. "We've reviewed your proposal samples, Emily," she said, "and we're very impressed. Are you available this Friday at 10? "I'll be there," I said without hesitation, though. In my mind, panic fluttered. Where would I take the call? The shelter had no private office. The Wi-Fi was patchy at best. I needed a space that didn't smell like industrial cleaner and fear. Jessica stepped in without hesitation again, offering her kitchen table and her laptop. She even took Sophie to the park that morning, whispering, "This is your shot, Emily. Don't downplay it. Go in like you already belong there." I dressed in my only remaining blazer, navy blue, and 2 years outdated. I brushed my hair into something neat, put on light makeup, and sat at her table like a woman who'd never lost her footing. When the screen lit up, I smiled steadily, professionally, like nothing had cracked beneath me. Tanya and a panel of 3 others greeted me. Their questions were precise, strategic, and sometimes sharp. But I met each one with calm answers I'd rehearsed 100 times. I told them how I'd increased engagement by 46% in a health initiative 2 years ago, how I'd built a rebranding campaign with a 10-day turnaround, how I didn't crumble under pressure, I recalibrated. When the call ended, I exhaled for the first time in an hour. The silence that followed felt different from the silence I had known. It didn't feel like suppression. It felt like possibility. 3 days later, Tanya called back. "We'd like to offer you the position," she said, her voice smooth, with something like respect. "Starting salary at 72, benefits included. We'll need you in office part-time, remote the rest." I couldn't speak for a moment. My voice caught somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. Yes, I finally said, "Yes, I accept." The shelter staff celebrated like it was their own victory. Tabitha hugged me in the hallway. "You did it, girl," she said. "This is your turn now." Sophie decorated a paper card with hearts and stick figures. "Mommy got the big job," she sang as she handed it to me. And for the first time since we left my parents' house, She looked like a child who believed in birthdays again. The next step was clear. We needed out of the shelter as soon as my first paycheck cleared. I dove into listings filtering for safe neighborhoods, good schools, and reasonable rent. What I found wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. A two-bedroom apartment on the west side tucked into a complex with a small community garden, old but well-maintained. The rent was within budget, and the landlord, an older woman named Rita, liked that. I had a steady offer in hand. I know a good mom when I meet one, she said, sliding the lease across the table. You're going to turn this place into something beautiful. We moved in on a Saturday. Volunteers from the shelter helped load donated furniture into a borrowed van. A battered couch, a second-hand table, twin beds for both of us. We unpacked our things with care, as if touching them too quickly might break the spell of starting over. Sophie picked the smaller room, hanging her pictures on the wall with tape, arranging her stuffed animals like sentinels of peace. It's perfect, she whispered as I tucked her in that night. Do we get to stay forever? My heart twisted. As long as we want, baby, I said and meant it. Working at North Star gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. My ideas mattered again. My voice wasn't filtered through someone else's agenda. My first project was small, a community wellness campaign, but the team treated me like I belonged. I was no longer surviving. I was contributing. But healing is never a straight line. It happened one afternoon during lunch. A colleague mentioned her parents were visiting for the weekend. She smiled as she scrolled through pictures of family picnics and stories of her childhood, and something in me unraveled. I excused myself to the bathroom and stared at my reflection under the harsh fluorescent light. My bruises had faded weeks ago, but the memory remained vivid and cruel. My father's face, my mother's indifference, the weight of knowing I could never go back even if I wanted to. I pressed my palms to the sink and whispered, "You're not that woman anymore," but some part of me still grieved the lie that family meant protection. That night after Sophie fell asleep, I sat on the living room floor. The apartment quiet around me, and opened a blank notebook. I wrote a single sentence. This is where it begins again, not with rage, but with reclamation. The next morning I woke early and opened every window in the apartment, letting fresh air wash over the space like baptism. I made pancakes from scratch, lit a candle, and played music that made Sophie twirl in the kitchen in her pajamas. Our lives were still stitched together from scraps, used furniture clearance store, clothes, leftover scars, but they were ours. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was building something real, something stable, something no one could take away again. We had started from ashes, yes, but fire didn't scare me anymore. Not when I'd already walked through it. The rhythm of our new life began to form, quiet but steady, like the first signs of heartbeat on an ultrasound. Delicate, real, miraculous. In the morning, Sophie and I shared toast and orange slices at the kitchen table, the sunlight angling in just right to make the dust in the air look like magic. In the evenings, we read books, our legs tangled together on the couch, her head on my shoulder, her breath even. Her nightmares had eased, not vanished but softened. And when she woke in the dark, she no longer screamed. She whispered my name, and I was there, always there. At work, I began to shine. The wellness campaign I spearheaded reached its engagement goals 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Tanya pulled me aside one afternoon, her voice low but firm. "You're not just good, Emily. You're exactly the kind of leadership we need around here." I thanked her, but I didn't tell her what those words meant to me. Not long ago, I'd stood in a kitchen bleeding, told by my own parents that I wasn't enough, that I was a burden, that I was the cause of my own collapse. Now I was building something with my own hands, something that couldn't be undone by anyone else's approval or absence. Still, healing has its ghosts. They visit without warning, and they don't knock. One Saturday, Sophie and I were walking through the farmer's market when I saw them. Barbara and Glenn Carter, arm in arm, dressed in their usual subdued tones. My mother with her rigid posture and her permanent scowl, my father trailing just behind her like a shadow trained to follow. My first instinct was to hide, to pull Sophie behind a booth of homemade candles and wait for them to pass. But she saw them too, and before I could stop her, she called out, "Grandma." Barbara turned slowly like a queen, acknowledging a peasant. Her gaze fell on Sophie. First, surprise, then calculation, then something like shame, and then on me. Emily, she said the word dry on her tongue. I stepped forward, placing myself between them and my daughter. We're just leaving, I said, my voice quiet but unshaking. We haven't seen her in months, my father said. You don't return our calls. I don't return silence masquerading as concern, I replied, my eyes fixed on theirs. You made your position clear. My mother's mouth tightened. You're being dramatic again. That wasn't abuse, Emily. Families lose their tempers. I inhaled slowly, choosing not to scream. He struck me, I said evenly, in front of my child. And you watched, then justified it. That's not temper, that's betrayal. Sophie reached for my hand, her small fingers wrapping around mine like an anchor. Can we go, Mommy? Yes, I said, my gaze never leaving theirs. We're done here. I walked away, my heart hammering my back tense, waiting for their voices to call me back, but they didn't. They let me go, or perhaps they simply no longer knew how to hold me. Later that night, I found Sophie sitting on the edge of her bed, her face drawn. Are they mad at us? She asked. No, I said gently. But some people can't love us in a safe way, and we have to love ourselves enough to walk away from that. She nodded, chewing her lip. Do you still love them? I didn't lie. I don't know, I said. But I love you more than anything, and that's what matters. She crawled into my lap, resting her head against my chest, and we sat like that for a long time. The next day, I made a decision, one that had been building inside me for weeks. I opened my laptop, pulled up the blank document, and began writing not just the story of what happened, but everything. The marriage, the betrayal, the breakdown, the shelter, the fear, the fight back. It poured out of me like something long dammed up, and with every word, I felt a little lighter. I called the piece The Fire That Shaped Us. I didn't know what I would do with it, yet submit it, share it anonymously, keep it in a drawer, but I knew I had to write it. Because silence had once protected my abusers, now it would serve me only on my terms. 2 weeks later, Sophie's teacher emailed me. She's made incredible progress. The message read, she talks about how strong her mom is, how safe she feels at home. I thought you should know. I cried when I read it. Not the desperate tears of survival, but the cleansing kind. The kind that come when you realize you've finally made a home out of nothing. We celebrated that weekend, just the two of us. I made spaghetti and let her eat ice cream for dinner. We danced to old Taylor Swift songs in the kitchen, Sophie spinning in circles until she collapsed in giggles on the floor. This wasn't the life I thought I'd have. But it was ours, and it was honest. I no longer measured our worth by what we had lost. I measured it by everything we'd built with what remained. There comes a moment after all the breaking and rebuilding when you realize you're no longer surviving. You're living, not just functioning on caffeine and cortisol, not just pressing through panic and pretending you're fine, but actually living where joy doesn't feel like a borrowed emotion and safety doesn't feel like a temporary pass. That moment came to me on a Thursday afternoon as I sat in my new office at North Star reviewing the pitch materials for our latest campaign. Outside the window, late autumn light spilled through the trees, dappling the room in gold. Inside, I sipped tea, steady, focused, and I felt that almost sacred stillness, not loud or cinematic, just real. My supervisor had emailed earlier that day, let's talk promotion next quarter. Leadership sees you. Leadership sees you. That simple sentence did more than validate my work. It echoed something deeper because for so long I hadn't been seen. Not by Tyler, not by my parents, not even by myself. I had blurred into roles, wife, daughter, victim, mother, never just Emily. Never the woman who made the impossible possible without applause, without backup. But now I was seen, and not just through someone else's filter. I had built visibility on my own terms. When I picked Sophie up from school that day, she raced across the playground, her backpack bouncing, her face flushed from the wind. Mommy, she cried, leaping into my arms. She smelled like crayons and apple juice and laughter. I got a star in reading, Mrs. Daniels said. I'm a storyteller, just like you. I kissed her forehead, her joy wrapping around me like armor. That's because you have your own stories to tell, sweetheart, I said. And you never have to shrink to fit into someone else's version of them. At home, our apartment was still modest. Our furniture still mismatched, the sink still dripped in that rhythm I kept meaning to fix. But it felt expansive, like every corner breathed differently now, as if the walls had learned to hold. not just our bodies, but our peace. That evening, Sophie painted quietly at the table while I prepared dinner. She drew a picture of a house with wide windows, two smiling stick figures standing outside holding hands. Above them, in shaky bubble letters, she wrote, "Me and Mommy's safe place." My throat caught and I had to blink hard, not out of grief, but gratitude. After Sophie went to bed, I sat at my desk and opened the story I'd been writing for weeks, The Fire That Shaped Us. The draft was complete. I had rewritten it again and again, not because I doubted the truth, but because I wanted every word to be exact, to cut where it needed to cut and to heal where it could. I hovered over the submit button on the essay portal for a national women's publication. For a moment, doubt flickered. Would this expose too much? Would people judge me, call me dramatic, or worse, call me a liar? But then I thought of Sophie, of how she'd whispered thank you in her sleep the night we left the shelter, of how she now slept peacefully, limbs splayed across her bed like she owned the night, of how she believed I was brave, and how finally I did too. I clicked submit. And with that, I released the story, not just into the world, but out of my own body. I no longer needed to carry it in silence. It was no longer my burden. It was my testament. The next morning, I received a reply faster than I expected. "We're honored to publish your story. It will run next month in our resilience issue." I sat in stunned silence. Then I laughed, not bitter or guarded, but open-free. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Not dramatically, but undeniably. Emails arrived from women who'd read my piece. Some were mothers, some were daughters. All of them had cracked along fault lines that mirrored mine. One message read, "You wrote the story I was too afraid to speak. Thank you for showing me that freedom isn't only for the lucky. Sometimes it's for the brave." I wrote back to each of them, not as a savior, but as a companion on the same long, hard road. Tyler emailed once, not to apologize, of course, but to catch up. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to catch. He belonged to a different chapter. I had finished writing long ago. As for my parents, I never heard from them again, and I've made peace with that. Because some ties are not meant to be mended, some doors are not meant to be reopened, and closure, I've learned, isn't something they give you. It's something you claim. It's been a year now since I left that house, a year since I pressed Sophie to my chest and walked through fire. Today, when people see me, they see a working mother, a resilient woman, a writer, a leader. But I know the truth. I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm thriving. Because healing isn't passive. It's a storm you walk through with your head high and your soul bleeding until the sky clears and you realize you made it. Not untouched, not unchanged, but undefeated. And that is liberation.